In the summer of 1137, death arrived at the doorstep of one of Europe's most powerful duchies, and with it came an opportunity that would reshape the continent forever. A 15-year-old girl was about to inherit more wealth and territory than the King of France himself possessed, setting in motion a chain of events that would define medieval politics for generations. This is the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose very name struck fear into the hearts of kings, and whose political brilliance would earn her the reputation as the most formidable female ruler of the Middle Ages. What made Eleanor so terrifying to her contemporaries wasn't just her vast inheritance or her strategic marriages to two different kings. It was her refusal to be controlled, her willingness to rebel against her own husband, and her uncanny ability to survive and thrive in a world designed to crush women who dared to claim power. She would spend 16 years as a prisoner, yet emerge to govern kingdoms and orchestrate the succession of kings well into her 80s. Her story challenges everything we think we know about women in medieval society. The year 1137 marked the beginning of what would become one of history's most extraordinary political careers. When Duke William X of Aquitaine collapsed and died during a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, he left behind a daughter who would soon discover that inheriting vast wealth as a woman in the 12th century was both a blessing and a curse. Eleanor found herself in possession of territories that stretched from the Loire Valley in the north all the way down to the Pyrenees in the south, encompassing some of the richest and most culturally sophisticated lands in all of Europe. The Duchy of Aquitaine was no ordinary inheritance. This was a realm of prosperous cities, fertile vineyards, bustling ports, and a court culture that had produced the troubadour tradition and revolutionary ideas about courtly love. The annual revenues from Eleanor's lands dwarfed those of the French royal domain, making her not just wealthy, but strategically invaluable to any ambitious ruler who could secure her alliance through marriage. At 15, she commanded the loyalty of thousands of knights and held sway over territories larger than those directly controlled by most kings. But here's where the story becomes fascinating from a legal and political perspective. Unlike many regions of medieval Europe that followed strict male inheritance laws, Aquitaine operated under customs that allowed daughters to inherit when no sons were available. This legal quirk meant that Eleanor wasn't just a wealthy heiress waiting to be married off to transfer her lands to a husband. She was the legitimate Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, with all the authority and responsibility that title entailed. The speed with which Eleanor's life changed after her father's death reveals just how valuable and vulnerable her position made her. Duke William, understanding the dangers his daughter would face, had placed her under the protection of King Louis VI of France in his will. This decision, while intended to safeguard Eleanor, immediately triggered a calculated political maneuver that would define her first marriage and launch her into the treacherous waters of royal politics. Louis VI, known to chroniclers as Louis the Fat, recognized the opportunity of a lifetime when news of Duke William's death reached Paris. The French royal domain was actually quite modest compared to the grand title the king held. The Capetian kings controlled a narrow strip of territory around Paris and Orleans, and their authority over the great feudal lords was more theoretical than practical. But if Louis could arrange a marriage between Eleanor and his son, the future Louis VII, the French crown would suddenly gain access to the wealthiest region in France. The marriage negotiations proceeded with breathtaking speed, revealing just how precarious Eleanor's position truly was. Within weeks of her father's death, arrangements were finalized for her to marry the heir to the French throne. Some historians suggest that Eleanor was essentially kidnapped by royal messengers who rode south with unseemly haste to secure her before other suitors could make their moves. The truth likely lies somewhere between outright coercion and the inevitable result of her father's will. But the episode demonstrates a crucial reality about medieval noble marriages among the powerful elite. The wedding ceremony itself, held in Bordeaux in July 1137, was carefully orchestrated to send specific political messages. Eleanor processed through the streets of her own city, cheered by crowds who recognized her as their duchess. The troubadours sang songs not about the French prince she was marrying, but about Eleanor herself, celebrating their lady and the cultural traditions of Aquitaine. Most significantly, the ceremony included a detail that contemporary observers noted with interest. Eleanor was invested as Duchess of Aquitaine before she exchanged marriage vows with Louis. This sequence wasn't accidental. The symbolism was deliberate and politically crucial. Eleanor wasn't simply becoming a queen consort who would fade into the background of her husband's reign. She was bringing an empire to this marriage as an equal partner, at least in legal theory. The marriage contract was explicit about this arrangement. While Louis would have authority over Eleanor's lands during their marriage, ownership remained with Eleanor herself. She could reclaim full control if the marriage ended, a provision that would prove critically important in later years. The cultural clash between Eleanor's sophisticated southern court and the austere northern French court became apparent immediately. Paris in the 1130s was a grey, drafty city where the royal palace reflected the grimmer Frankish traditions of the north. The French courtiers were suspicious of Eleanor's southern ways, her love of poetry and music, her fashionable clothing, and most troublingly, her tendency to express educated opinions freely in council meetings. In Aquitaine, women of noble birth were expected to be literate, cultured, and capable of managing estates when their husbands were away at war. In the northern French court, they were expected to be decorative, silent, and focused solely on producing male heirs. Eleanor's early influence on French politics was remarkable for someone so young. Within her first year as queen, she personally intervened to save the town of Poitiers from her husband's wrath. When the citizens rebelled against a royal official, Louis wanted to punish them severely, possibly stripping the town of its privileges. Eleanor argued for mercy, reminding him that these were her people and that harsh punishment would breed lasting resentment. Her counsel proved wise when the town remained loyal, demonstrating that even as a teenager, Eleanor possessed sophisticated political instincts. The marriage between Eleanor and Louis VII was supposed to create a fairy tale union of vast territories and royal authority. Instead, it revealed the fundamental contradictions and tensions that would define Eleanor's entire political career. She had married into the French royal family as both a subordinate wife and an independent territorial ruler, creating a legal ambiguity that neither she nor Louis fully knew how to navigate. Medieval law wasn't clean about such arrangements, and when two powerful entities married, the resulting legal complications could be spectacular. Louis viewed their marriage through a lens of devotion that bordered on possession. He was genuinely infatuated with Eleanor, wanting her by his side constantly, not necessarily because he valued her political counsel, though sometimes he did, but because he had become emotionally dependent on her presence. This created an interesting dynamic where Eleanor had his ear and could influence policy, but she also had to manage his emotional needs and jealousies, skills that would prove crucial as their marriage deteriorated. The pressure to produce a male heir became the defining tension of Eleanor's first marriage. She and Louis had been married for several years and had produced only one child, a daughter named Marie. In the brutal mathematics of medieval royal succession, daughters were pleasant but insufficient for securing dynastic continuity. Eleanor needed to produce sons, and the longer she failed to do so, the more whispers began to circulate about divine displeasure with their union. These whispers took on a particularly sinister tone because of a traumatic incident that haunted Louis's conscience and, by extension, their marriage. In 1142, during a siege of the town of Vitry-le-Français, Louis's soldiers set fire to buildings where approximately 1,300 people had taken refuge in a church. The civilians burned to death in what became known as one of the most horrific massacres of the era. Louis, who had originally wanted to become a monk before his older brother's death made him heir to the throne, was devastated by the tragedy and became convinced that God was punishing him for the massacre. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of the age, and a man who viewed powerful women with deep suspicion became involved in Eleanor's marital troubles. Bernard was a stern ascetic who believed that female beauty and influence were inherently dangerous to male souls. He saw Eleanor, with her wealth, culture, and political opinions, as exactly the kind of woman who led men astray from proper Christian devotion. While Bernard couldn't criticize Eleanor directly without risking a confrontation with the Queen of France, his sermons and letters made his views abundantly clear. The stage was now set for the conflict that would define Eleanor's reputation and ultimately destroy her first marriage. In 1147, Louis VII took the cross, meaning he vowed to join the Second Crusade to reclaim Christian territory in the Holy Land. Eleanor made the momentous decision to accompany him, not as a supportive wife quietly tending to wounded soldiers, but as the Duchess of Aquitaine leading her own contingent of vassals. This decision would expose all the fault lines in their marriage and set Eleanor on a path toward the most consequential divorce in medieval history. The preparations for the Second Crusade revealed just how determined Eleanor was to assert her authority on the international stage. She wasn't content to remain in France, managing domestic affairs while her husband pursued military glory in distant lands. Instead, she organized hundreds of knights and soldiers from Aquitaine, arranged complex supply lines, and commissioned equipment for what would become one of the most ambitious military expeditions of the medieval period. Contemporary sources suggest that Eleanor approached this crusade with the same meticulous planning she brought to governing her duchy, treating it as both a religious pilgrimage and a political opportunity. The image Eleanor projected during the crusade preparations scandalized conservative observers across Europe. Rather than adopting the somber, penitential attitude that monks believed appropriate for a sacred military expedition, Eleanor maintained the sophisticated elegance that had always defined her public persona. Some chroniclers, writing with obvious disapproval years later, claimed that she and her ladies dressed inappropriately for the journey, though these accounts are almost certainly exaggerated by writers who already viewed Eleanor with suspicion. The Second Crusade proved to be a catastrophic failure from virtually every perspective, accomplishing almost nothing while losing thousands of lives and severely damaging the reputation of European military prowess. Louis VII's leadership was indecisive at best, and the crusading army fractured into competing factions that seemed more interested in fighting each other than reclaiming territory from Muslim forces. But what makes Eleanor's participation particularly significant is how contemporary chroniclers chose to assign blame for this disaster. When the crusade began to unravel, male chroniclers found it convenient to blame Eleanor's presence as a distraction and source of division within the army. This represented a familiar pattern of scapegoating that powerful women faced throughout the medieval period. When military campaigns failed or political situations deteriorated, the easiest explanation was often to blame female influence, particularly if a prominent woman had dared to express opinions or take active roles in decision-making. The journey eastward was grueling beyond anything Eleanor could have anticipated. The crusading army traveled through Germany and then through the treacherous terrain of Anatolia, where Byzantine guides proved unreliable and Turkish forces harassed the Christian forces constantly. The heat was unbearable, water was scarce, and soldiers began dying of thirst and disease before they even encountered major enemy resistance. Eleanor experienced this nightmare in real time, watching the great crusading expedition deteriorate into a desperate, struggling mob of increasingly demoralized fighters. The crisis reached its peak during the disastrous battle at Mount Cadmos, where Louis made crucial tactical errors that left the French forces vulnerable to a devastating Turkish attack. The army was routed, hundreds were killed, and Louis himself barely escaped with his life. Eleanor survived because the Aquitanian forces under her command maintained better discipline than the French contingents, a detail that chroniclers would conveniently forget when later assigning responsibility for the Crusade's failures. The breaking point came when the surviving Crusaders finally reached Antioch in March 1148. The city was ruled by Eleanor's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, a charismatic and ambitious man who welcomed his niece warmly, perhaps too warmly in the opinion of Louis's increasingly paranoid courtiers. Raymond proposed a strategically sound military plan to attack Aleppo, which would have given the crusade a realistic chance of achieving meaningful territorial gains. Eleanor supported this strategy because it represented far better military thinking than anything Louis and his advisors had proposed. Louis refused Raymond's plan, partly for legitimate strategic reasons, but mostly, it seems, because he had become jealous of the rapport between Eleanor and her uncle. This is where the destructive rumours began that would follow Eleanor for the rest of her life. Chroniclers later claimed that Eleanor's relationship with Raymond was inappropriate, even incestuous, suggesting that she spent too much time in private counsel with him and preferred his company to her husband's. These accusations were almost certainly fabricated, but they served the purpose of transforming a political disagreement into a sexual scandal. The pattern here reveals something crucial about how medieval society responded to powerful women who challenged male authority. When Eleanor publicly disagreed with Louis on military strategy, supporting her uncle's more sensible plan over her husband's religiously motivated but strategically foolish decision to march directly to Jerusalem, she was accused of sexual impropriety. This was the standard method for discrediting women who exercised political judgment that contradicted male decisions. The confrontation between Eleanor and Louis at Antioch was explosive and marked the point of no return for their marriage. Eleanor argued passionately for Raymond's military strategy, recognizing that Louis's alternative plan was driven more by religious sentiment than tactical wisdom. When Louis announced that the army would march to Jerusalem instead of attacking Aleppo, Eleanor's fury was unmistakable to everyone present. In her anger, she said something that could never be taken back, threatening to seek an annulment of their marriage. Eleanor's threat wasn't based on sudden emotion, but on a calculated legal strategy. She pointed out that she and Louis were related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity, meaning they were distant cousins whose marriage technically violated church law, forbidding unions between relatives closer than 7 degrees of kinship. This wasn't a new discovery. Every noble marriage dealt with similar issues because aristocratic families had been intermarrying for generations. But consanguinity served as the medieval equivalent of a legal escape clause, providing grounds for dissolving marriages when politically convenient. Louis's response revealed just how possessive he had become toward Eleanor and her territories. According to chroniclers, he essentially forced her to accompany him to Jerusalem, refusing to allow her to remain in Antioch regardless of her wishes. Eleanor found herself in the humiliating position of being treated like property that her husband refused to relinquish, despite being the Queen of France and Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. The entire court witnessed this breakdown in their marriage, and gossip about their conflict spread throughout the Crusader camps. The siege of Damascus in July 1148 provided the final demonstration of the Second Crusade's strategic incompetence. The Crusaders attacked Damascus despite the city being allied with Jerusalem against other Muslim powers, making the assault not just militarily difficult but politically counterproductive. The siege failed miserably after just 4 days, and the remnants of the crusading army began the long journey back to Europe in disgrace. Eleanor and Louis travelled separately on the return journey, a clear signal to all observers that their marriage was effectively over. By the time they reached Italy in 1149, everyone in European political circles knew that the King and Queen of France were heading toward divorce. Pope Eugene III, desperate to prevent this scandal from undermining the prestige of both the French crown and the crusading movement, intervened personally to attempt a reconciliation. The Pope's efforts to save their marriage were almost touching in their naivety. He met with Eleanor and Louis, counselled reconciliation, and even prepared a luxurious bedchamber, hoping that privacy and comfort might rekindle their affection. But Eugene completely misunderstood the situation. This wasn't about hurt feelings or temporary anger. This was about fundamental incompatibility and Eleanor's determination to escape a marriage that had become a political and personal prison. Eleanor and Louis maintained a cold truce for several years after returning to France, going through the motions of royal partnership, while everyone understood that their marriage was effectively dead. Eleanor was strategizing and planning her exit, waiting for the right moment to make her move. Medieval divorce was complicated, requiring papal approval and careful attention to protecting any children from the union. But Eleanor was patient and politically sophisticated enough to navigate these challenges. The annulment proceedings that finally freed Eleanor from her marriage to Louis VII were based on the consanguinity claim she had first raised at Antioch. In March 1152, after 15 years of marriage that had produced 2 daughters but no male heir, the Church formally declared their union invalid. The terms Eleanor negotiated were crucial to her future independence. She retained full possession of Aquitaine while her daughters remained in the French court, a painful but strategically necessary concession that allowed her to reclaim her duchy without prolonged legal battles. Within 8 weeks of her divorce, Eleanor had remarried, choosing Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, in a match that would create the most powerful empire in Western Europe. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor, which generated considerable gossip, but age was irrelevant compared to what this marriage represented politically. Henry had a strong claim to the English throne and already controlled significant territories in France. By marrying Eleanor, he gained access to Aquitaine and suddenly controlled more French territory than the King of France himself. The speed of Eleanor's remarriage suggests careful planning that began long before her annulment was finalized. She understood that wealthy, unmarried heiresses were vulnerable to abduction or forced marriage, so she needed protection immediately. But this wasn't just a defensive move. Eleanor was choosing her second husband based on strategic calculations about building something greater than either of them could achieve alone. Henry represented ambition, military prowess, and the potential to create an empire that would dominate European politics for generations. The marriage ceremony at Poitiers Cathedral was a deliberate assertion of Eleanor's independence and authority. She chose to marry in her own city, surrounded by her own people, making it clear that this union was happening on her terms. The symbolism wasn't lost on her former husband, Louis VII, who realized too late that his most powerful vassal had just married his ex-wife and now controlled territories that dwarfed the French royal domain. Eleanor had executed one of the most audacious political maneuvers of the medieval period, divorcing a king and immediately marrying another future king while reclaiming full control of her ancestral lands, Rall lands. When Henry Plantagenet became King of England in 1154, Eleanor found herself transformed from the divorced ex-Queen of France into the Queen of England, commanding an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains. This wasn't merely a change in title or geography. Eleanor had become co-architect of what historians would later call the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories held together by feudal bonds, dynastic claims, and the sheer force of will that both she and Henry possessed in abundance. The empire they ruled together was unwieldy and disconnected, requiring constant attention and movement to maintain control. Henry couldn't be everywhere at once, which meant Eleanor often found herself governing vast territories in his absence. This wasn't the ceremonial role that most queens occupied, where they simply held court and looked regal while real decisions were made by male advisors. Eleanor was actually running kingdoms, issuing writs in her own name, hearing legal cases, and making decisions that affected thousands of lives across multiple territories. Her administrative competence during the 1150s and 1160s was remarkable by any standard. Eleanor oversaw the complex governance of Aquitaine throughout these decades, maintaining order in a region notorious for its independent-minded nobility. The southern lords valued their autonomy and historically resented outside interference, yet Eleanor managed to keep them mostly loyal through a combination of personal relationships built over decades, strategic distribution of favors and privileges, and the implied threat of Henry's military power backing her authority. But Eleanor was doing far more than simply governing during these years. She was producing heirs at a pace that would exhaust anyone. This is where her second marriage differed dramatically from her barren years with Louis VII. With Henry, Eleanor had 8 children in 13 years, an extraordinary fertility that secured the dynasty's future while taking an enormous physical toll on her body. Medieval childbirth was dangerous under the best circumstances, and Eleanor was essentially pregnant for much of the 1150s and 1160s, while simultaneously running an empire. The children Eleanor bore would reshape European history in ways that even she couldn't have anticipated. Henry the young king, born in 1155, would be crowned as junior king during his father's lifetime in an attempt to secure the succession. Richard, born in 1157, would become the legendary warrior king known as Richard the Lionheart. Geoffrey, born in 1158, would claim Brittany through marriage. John, born in 1166, would eventually rule England as one of its most controversial monarchs. Each of these children represented not just personal fulfillment for Eleanor, but political assets in the great game of medieval power politics. Eleanor's court during these peak years became a center of cultural sophistication that rivaled anything in Europe. Even while bearing children and governing territories, she maintained her patronage of troubadours and poets, ensuring that her courts remained centers of learning and artistic refinement. This wasn't frivolous entertainment, but calculated political theater designed to demonstrate that the Angevin Empire wasn't just militarily powerful, but culturally superior to its rivals. The relationship between Eleanor and Henry during these early years of their marriage appears to have been genuinely passionate, or at least functionally successful in ways her first marriage never was. Henry was energetic, intelligent, and shared Eleanor's political instincts. He was also notoriously unfaithful, a common trait among medieval kings that Eleanor seems to have accepted as the price of marrying an ambitious, virile younger man. There's no evidence that she objected to his affairs during the 1150s and early 1160s, perhaps because she was too busy with governance and childbearing to worry about where Henry spent his nights when they were apart. Eleanor was also thinking dynastically during these years, planning decades ahead to ensure that the Plantagenet Empire would endure through her children. She wasn't simply raising offspring, but preparing future rulers. Her sons received education in governance, military arts, and the complex web of feudal relationships they would need to navigate. Her daughters were being groomed for strategic marriages that would extend the family's influence across Europe. Eleanor understood that political success required long-term planning and careful cultivation of the next generation. The empire faced constant challenges from Eleanor's former husband, Louis VII, who hadn't forgotten or forgiven her remarriage. The French king had limited resources compared to the Angevin Empire, but he possessed legitimacy as overlord and the ability to cause significant trouble by supporting rebellious vassals and probing for weaknesses in Henry's control. Eleanor and Henry spent these years in constant low-level conflict with France, engaging in raids, counter-raids, sieges, and temporary truces that everyone knew wouldn't last. Eleanor was also dealing with the growing conflict between Henry and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, though this crisis wouldn't explode until the late 1160s. She watched as Henry tried to assert royal authority over church courts and clergy, while Becket resisted with equal determination. This conflict would eventually destroy Becket and damage Henry's reputation. But in the early years of their reign, it was simply one more political challenge to navigate among many. The legal system that Eleanor helped Henry develop would outlast both of them and fundamentally reshape English governance. Henry was passionate about legal reform, wanting consistent justice across England and seeking to reduce the power of baronial courts in favor of royal law. Eleanor supported these efforts because strong royal justice meant strong royal authority, and she understood that centralized legal systems benefited queens as much as kings. When royal law was supreme, her writs carried weight everywhere. Eleanor heard legal cases personally, sitting in judgment like any king, and rendering verdicts on disputes about land, inheritance, commercial contracts, and criminal matters. Medieval people believed that monarchs had a sacred duty to dispense justice, and this duty didn't disappear simply because the monarch happened to be female. Some of Eleanor's judgments survive in court records, revealing a sharp legal mind that understood both the letter and spirit of law. The financial management Eleanor oversaw was sophisticated and complex, requiring numeracy, attention to detail, and the ability to detect when officials were embezzling, which they constantly were. Royal revenues came from dozens of sources, including rents from crown lands, feudal dues from vassals, profits from royal courts, income from forests and mines, and customs duties from ports. These revenues had to be collected, recorded, and allocated to everything from military campaigns to building projects to the daily expenses of maintaining a mobile royal household. Eleanor was also serving as a diplomatic bridge between England and the continental possessions, particularly Aquitaine. When southern nobles had grievances or requests, they often appealed to Eleanor rather than Henry because she understood their language, literally and figuratively, and their culture in ways Henry never would. She mediated between her Aquitanian vassals and Henry's broader imperial priorities, translating not just languages, but entire worldviews. But beneath this competent governance and successful partnership, tensions were building that would eventually tear the empire apart. Henry was becoming more confident and less willing to consult Eleanor on major decisions. As their sons grew older, questions about inheritance and authority within the empire would create family conflicts that neither parent could resolve. Most significantly, Henry's infidelities, which Eleanor had tolerated for years, would take a turn that she would find absolutely intolerable. The stage was being set for the great crisis that would define the latter half of Eleanor's life. The woman who had successfully navigated divorce from one king and marriage to another, who had governed kingdoms and produced a dynasty, was about to face her greatest challenge yet. The partnership that had created an empire was about to destroy itself through family rebellion, and Eleanor would find herself choosing between loyalty to her husband and support for her sons in a conflict that would reshape European politics forever. Eleanor's world began to fracture in the most personal way imaginable. The breaking point wasn't a military defeat or political setback, but something far more intimate and devastating. Henry took a mistress named Rosamund Clifford, known as Fair Rosamund in the romantic legends that would later spring up around her story. This wasn't unusual behavior for a medieval king, and Eleanor had tolerated Henry's previous affairs with the pragmatic acceptance of a woman who understood the realities of royal marriage. But this affair was different, and Eleanor knew it immediately. Henry didn't simply take Rosamund as a convenient sexual partner. He fell genuinely in love with her, keeping her openly at court and showering her with attention that had once belonged exclusively to Eleanor. The humiliation was public and calculated, or so it seemed to a queen who had spent decades learning to read the subtle language of court politics. Eleanor was approaching 50, had borne Henry 8 children, and had governed his empire with skill and dedication. Now she watched as her husband replaced her with a girl young enough to be their daughter. The chroniclers, always eager for scandal involving powerful women, claimed that Eleanor was murderously jealous of Fair Rosamund. Later legends would weave elaborate tales of Eleanor poisoning her rival or forcing her to choose between death by dagger or death by poison. These stories are almost certainly fictional, but they reveal something important about how medieval society processed the idea of a powerful woman scorned. The truth was probably simpler and more painful. Rosamund likely died of natural causes in a nunnery, but Eleanor's emotional devastation was real and politically significant. What made Henry's affair with Rosamund so destructive wasn't just personal betrayal, though that was certainly part of it. This relationship represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of their marriage. For 20 years, Eleanor had been Henry's partner in building and governing an empire. She brought Aquitaine to their union, provided political expertise, and demonstrated administrative competence that made her indispensable to their shared success. But Henry's infatuation with Rosamond suggested that he no longer needed or wanted Eleanor as a partner. She was being reduced from co-ruler to discarded wife. The timing of this personal crisis coincided with growing tensions over inheritance that had been simmering for years. Henry controlled vast territories and had 4 surviving sons who all expected substantial inheritances. In 1170, he made what seemed like a reasonable decision, but turned out to be catastrophic for family harmony. He had his eldest surviving son, also named Henry, crowned as junior king, while Henry Sr. was still alive. Young Henry became the young king, associated with his father's rule and formally anointed, but given no actual power or territory to govern independently. This arrangement was meant to secure the succession and prevent disputes after the old king's death. Instead, it created a prince with a king's title, but no kingdom, which proved to be an explosive combination. Eleanor watched this unfold with growing alarm, recognizing the inherent instability of the situation. Young Henry had been raised to rule, taught that kingship was his destiny, and now he possessed the crown, but none of the authority. He was receiving an allowance like a child, instead of governing territories like the king he had been proclaimed to be. Eleanor's other sons faced similar frustrations with their father's unwillingness to share real power. Richard was designated to inherit Aquitaine through Eleanor, but Henry Sr. maintained tight control over the duchy's governance. Geoffrey was promised Brittany through marriage, but again under his father's oversight. John, the youngest, was nicknamed Lackland because there was literally nothing left to give him after his older brothers received their promised inheritances. All of Eleanor's sons were waiting for power that their father refused to release, creating a family dynamic that was both psychologically destructive and politically dangerous. The convergence of Eleanor's personal humiliation over Henry's affair and her sons' frustration with their father's authoritarian control created the perfect conditions for rebellion. Eleanor made a choice that would define the rest of her life and cement her reputation as one of history's most formidable political operators. She decided to support her sons against their father, transforming from loyal wife into active rebel in a decision that medieval chroniclers would struggle to explain, except by painting her as evil or manipulative. Eleanor's reasoning was actually quite clear and strategically sound. Henry had sidelined her personally and politically, reducing her from partner to ornament while publicly humiliating her with his young mistress. By supporting her sons' demands for real authority, she could simultaneously advance their legitimate interests and reclaim her own political relevance. If her sons controlled territories independently, Eleanor could govern through them, maintaining power even as Henry tried to push her aside. It was a brilliant calculation that recognized the changing dynamics within the family and the empire. The rebellion that erupted in 1173 was a family civil war that nearly destroyed everything Henry and Eleanor had built together. Young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey all rose against their father, demanding the territories they had been promised. Eleanor's former husband, Louis VII of France, gleefully supported the rebellion because anything that weakened the Angevin Empire served French interests. The Count of Flanders joined the rebels, as did various baronial factions in England and Normandy, who saw an opportunity to resist royal authority. Eleanor didn't simply encourage her sons from the sidelines. She actively coordinated the rebellion, traveling between different courts, carrying messages, and using her authority in Aquitaine to provide resources and safe havens for the rebel forces. She was committing treason against her husband in the most technical sense, using her political skills and territorial authority to undermine his power. It was the ultimate act of defiance from a woman who had spent decades exercising authority within the constraints of marriage. At some point during the rebellion, Eleanor attempted to flee to Paris where she would have been safe under French protection. She disguised herself as a man, apparently believing that masculine clothing would allow her to travel through hostile territory without being recognized. The image is almost comical in hindsight, a 50-year-old queen dressed in male attire trying to sneak across medieval France. But it also reveals Eleanor's desperation and resourcefulness. She was willing to take extraordinary risks to escape Henry's control and reach sanctuary with her former husband. Eleanor's escape attempt failed. She was captured, recognized despite her disguise, and brought back as Henry's prisoner. The rebellion continued for another year, but without Eleanor's coordination and the resources she provided from Aquitaine, the rebel forces gradually lost momentum. Henry proved himself a brilliant military commander, despite facing enemies on multiple fronts, systematically defeating the various rebel armies and negotiating the submission of his sons. By the end of 1174, the Great Rebellion had collapsed. Young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey all submitted to their father and were forgiven because they were his sons and the future of the dynasty. Eleanor was different. She wasn't essential to the succession anymore, having already produced the necessary heirs. She wasn't essential to governance, as Henry had capable officials who could run the empire without her. Most dangerously, she had proven herself to be a political threat who could use her skills and authority to nearly destroy everything Henry had built. Henry's solution was both simple and devastating. He imprisoned Eleanor, not in chains or a dungeon, but under house arrest that would last for 16 years. She was moved from castle to castle, always under guard, prevented from traveling freely or exercising any political authority. For a woman whose entire identity was built around political action and cultural influence, this imprisonment was a form of torture more effective than any physical punishment. The imprisonment also reveals the inherent vulnerability of even the most powerful medieval women. Eleanor could inherit duchies, govern kingdoms, and command the respect of thousands, but she remained legally subject to her husband's authority. Henry could confine her without trial or legal process, because wives who committed treason could be punished by their husbands under medieval law. The very structures that had enabled Eleanor's power contained the mechanisms for its complete suppression. Eleanor of Aquitaine died at Fontevraud Abbey on April 1st, 1204, at the extraordinary age of 82, having outlived most of her children and witnessed the collapse of the empire she helped create. Yet her legacy transcends the territorial losses and dynastic failures that marked her final years. She had proven that medieval queens could govern as effectively as kings, that women could exercise genuine political authority when circumstances allowed, and that even the most restrictive patriarchal systems contained cracks that extraordinary individuals could exploit. Eleanor's story remains a testament to the power of intelligence, determination, and sheer refusal to be diminished by the limitations any society tries to impose.